Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the necessary shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm joined from Cape Cod by my partner in this enterprise, Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Eliot, welcome from the Cape.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. I have to say there are very few things that would take me away from a crystalline New England day where I just swam back and forth across a pond and was skipping through the breakers on the ocean side of Wellfleet. But to be here with Peter Feaver and with you, I would miss anything for that.
Well, I think you should introduce our guest since he was your 2T at Harvard. So you're responsible for all of his ideas, good and bad.
I was just a year or two ahead of him, and so like one of those awful private schools where the upperclassmen get to beat up the ones who are 1 or 2 years below them. But Peter has forgiven me, I think. So our friend Peter Feaver, and he really is our friend, he's been on this podcast before, is one of the country's leading experts on civil military relations. He's a professor at Duke University. He is, however, also unusually somebody who's from academia, who has seen a lot of the world of practice, including serving on the National Security Council staff as I guess the main strategic planner.
Two tours on the National Security Council staff.
2 tours, yes. Served as a naval reservist, which is probably not irrelevant to the topic of the book. All around good guy, which doesn't mean that we will give him an easy time. We will not. Who has just written a very interesting book called Thank You for Your Service. It's as you said, Eric, a data-rich study of civil military relations. I'm going to begin just by framing it and then throwing it to you, Peter, to kind of open up the discussion. I think one of the points you make, which is a great point, is the American public, by and large, although there's been some slippage recently, has quite a high view of the American military, particularly in comparison with other institutions in American society. And what's equally interesting is the one thing that they may know about the military is that everybody else thinks that way too. So why don't you take that and run with it for a bit?
Well, thanks. And I'm honored. I think I'm a triple offender, 3 strikes and I'm out. But thank you for having me back. I must say also thank you, Eliot, for your generous blurb. You blurbed the book. And when I first read your blurb, I thought you said Peter is one of academia's most cute observers. And I thought, oh, that's a very flattering thing. Then I read it again. No, it's acute observers. I'll take it either way. But the point you flagged at the outset is an important one. This is a social fact. The idea of that the public has high esteem in the military. This is a social fact that is known by other Americans, and it's one of the few things they know about the military. When you probe detailed questions, you get either the I don't know response or you get wild guesses that are wrong. It's also one of the few things that the military knows about American public opinion. So I bet you've had the experience. You really can't have a conversation with a senior military leader that goes past 5 minutes before they'll point out that the military is held in high esteem. It's something the military cares about, and the book says they're right to care about it. The book also reminds people that it was not always so. So it's not as if since the founding of the Republic, Americans have held the professional military in high esteem. I would say for most of our history, we held the citizen soldier in high esteem, the one who answered the call of the bugle and rushed to rescue the country, but then went home to the farm plow. And the professional military who served during peacetime, they were not held in high esteem. That created a crisis after the shift to all volunteer force, when we had to recruit people into this so-called low esteem service for an extended period of time. And I think the pivot point in the chronology is the Reagan era, when Reagan rebuilt confidence in the military and was able to, have that confidence be extended to the professional military, not just to the wartime military. And that's more or less held true for the last 4 decades.
How healthy is that degree of esteem and that awareness on the part of the military about it? Because on the one hand, obviously, you do want to have people appreciate the sacrifices that some military people make, not all military people, let's remember. But on the other hand, and I'll betray my own views, I think there are also pernicious consequences from this, including a degree of escaping real accountability. Or am I being too harsh?
Well, so there's really two questions you can ask from the skeptic's eye. One is, it's high, but will it remain high? And I'm of the view that says it's high but hollow. Of course, in the last several years, it's gone down, and we can dig into that in a moment if you want. The other skeptic's question is the one you asked, which is, it's high, but is that a good thing? And my view is that it comes with some positives and it comes with some negatives. And all in all, the positives outweigh the negatives. And I would rather have the problems we have with American high esteem of the military than the problems that, say, Canada might have, or some of our NATO partners have, with low esteem of a military that they need for national security purposes. There are things that are worse, even amongst our, advanced industrial democracies. There are civil military problems that are worse than the ones we have here. But you do put your finger on one of the downsides. When you hold the military in such high esteem, you're putting them on a pedestal. And in the book, I talk about pedestalization. When you put someone on a pedestal, they are up there looking down and potentially looking down on you. And it's an invitation, an opportunity for alienation on both ends. You have unreasonable expectations of them, and then when they fail, boom, you knock them down and trample on them. But up there, if they're on the pedestal, they can avoid some of the messiness that comes from being down amongst the rest of us. And in the book, I particularly draw attention to what I call the partisan blame game, which is an opportunity that the military have to play off of their high status and avoid accountability, avoid some of the tough scrutiny for operational challenges or even outright failures that happened on their watch. And so when the military is held in high esteem, that's easier to play that game, and that's a cost of high
Eric,
confidence.
you had to live that. Do you want to?
Yeah, I want to dig into some of this with you, Peter. So one of the points you make in the book is that, and for the benefit of our listeners, I think it's worth explaining that this is based on two very large surveys, proprietary surveys that you conducted in 2019 and 2020, but it also draws on a wealth of other data, Gallup polling, the American National Election Survey data. There are lots of sources of data here. And as Eliot said, as I've mentioned, it's a very data-rich book. But the real, correct me if I've got it wrong, but from reading it, the real increase, you talked about the low esteem that the all-volunteer force faced in the wake of Vietnam and trying to recruit a force, then also problems of drugs, Chief of Staff of the Army saying it was a hollow army, etc. The real two enormous boosts to the public estimation of the military were the first Gulf War in 1991, and then 9/11 and the deployment of the U.S. military into the wars against terrorists that followed on from that. But to dig into what Eliot was just saying, the public also seems quite ambivalent about those wars. The endless wars, the forever wars, they were clearly inconclusive. In the case of Afghanistan, it ended, disastrously and tragically in 2021. And yet, I would say, and from my own experience here, that in the Pentagon, the military has really escaped from a lot of accountability. And you found that there is this sort of immunity from prosecution, if you will, in the data about public attitudes. I mean, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And let me just emphasize for our listener that the data was proprietary, but it's now available for anyone to download. So if you're a grad student looking for something to write a paper on and you need to show off your statistical analytical chops, download these data files, because the book just barely scratches the surface of what we got. But one of the things, surveying in 2020, which is before the Biden decision to leave regardless of consequences, but still in the middle of President Trump's debate about, or signaling that he wanted to leave Afghanistan regardless of consequences. So the policy issue was available for the public to evaluate. And it was clear that the war in Afghanistan by 2020 was not going the way we all hoped it would, in the early 2002 timeframe, and thought maybe it had a chance of going. What was interesting was when you dug into the respondents and disaggregated by whether they were Republican or Democrat or independent, and then asked them more specific questions about who should get blame, who should get credit, how did our leaders do in the conduct of the war? So much more nuanced questions than previous polls have asked. This odd pattern emerged where Democratic respondents would say Democratic leaders did pretty well, as did the military, but Republican leaders really screwed up the war. And then Republican leaders would say Republican leaders did pretty well, as did the military, but Democratic leaders screwed up. In other words, the partisans were willing to blame the other partisan civilian leader, but not blame the military. And if it was a question of giving credit, they would give credit to the military. If it was a question about blame, they'd give blame to the civilian leaders. Now, as you know, you both served at senior levels as civilians. Civilians do make mistakes, so they should be held accountable.
Absolutely. And I want to stipulate for all our listeners that I am not suggesting that civilians did not make mistakes or, should not bear plenty of share of the blame for things that went wrong in either of those two conflicts.
But what the polling suggests is that the civilians do not enjoy any insulation beyond partisanship, whereas the military enjoys an insulation from criticism and possibly from accountability, just by virtue, and they can sort of attach themselves to whichever is the insulated partisan civilian leader. Now, our polls weren't showing that the military was actively fomenting this, but our polls showed that this was available to the military when they're in the hot seat. And so that is a potential downside of high confidence, because it could insulate the military. If I had money to do more surveys now, I'd want to follow up, because it's now 2 years after the disastrous departure. And what is the public thinking now about the military? My own guess would be that the military is still avoiding suffering the most blame, and the decline in confidence is not really driven so much by Afghanistan as by other factors. But that's an empirical question worth investigating.
I mean, I agree with the basic conclusion, but I think I'd push the implications harder. I think it's extremely unhealthy, because look, when you had a draft-based military, people saw the underside of the military. The military is a big, complicated organization with a lot of wonderful people and a lot of not so wonderful people. and which does some things brilliantly well and some things, that are just stupid or bizarre or incompetent or ineffective. And in a draft military, everybody knew that. I mean, hence cartoon strips like Beetle Bailey, which I have no idea how that one survives, although it seems to, which is, the army is seen from the point of view of a draftee, basically. And I think the result was a kind of a healthy wariness. Whereas I really do feel that when we look at the Afghan and Iraq wars, although there were some very big successes, I would think about the surge, which you played a role in, Peter. You definitely did, Eric. I played maybe a minor role in it, but it was a military idea executed by military people, so they're the ones who really deserve the credit for it. But you also had things which were appalling, and I'll give you just one example. When I first went to Afghanistan for Secretary Rice in 2007, and I was astonished. There were like 7 different chains of command. There were seven different wars. You had an American force, Operation Enduring Freedom. You had a NATO chain of command. You had the so-called White Special Operations Forces. They were fighting their own war. That's sort of the Green Berets. You had Black Special Operations Forces. In other words, Delta, the super secret ones. They're fighting their own war. CIA is fighting its own war. The people who were responsible for training the Afghan military, but were also conducting operations, they were fighting their war. And when I talked to military people about that, and I said, what about this unity of command thing that you're already always preaching? So no, we coordinate just fine, which is exactly what the 2 commanders at Pearl Harbor said, by the way, after the attack. And there are similar things or other pieces of malpractice. So this will be a bit down in the weeds. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, we rotated divisional headquarters. So these are very high level headquarters every year, which meant that you obliterated any institutional memory of what you had been doing. You incentivized people to drop their predecessors' plans in favor of their own plans. But it caused all kinds of distortions. It was completely unnecessary. That was a military judgment. The civilians had nothing to do with it. And I felt it really had a deleterious effect on our conduct of the war. And not only have I not heard criticism of this from the outside, the thing that troubles me most is I don't think the United States military really kind of held up a mirror to itself after the first decade or so in Afghanistan and Iraq, saying, where did we screw up? Because they most certainly did.
So there's 2 things here, and they're worth distinguishing. One is they're both drivers of public confidence, by the way. One is what I call patriotism, and that's the rally to the flag. So after 9/11, public confidence in the military went up immediately, not because the military had done anything yet, but because we were in wartime, and so there's a rally effect. And this rally effect is probably the number one pillar undergirding public confidence in the military. If you can only ask one question and you have to predict confidence, ask, are we at war or not? And if we're at war, public confidence is likely to be higher. If we're not, it's likely to be lower. The second, though, gets to the heart of what you were talking about, Eliot, and that's performance. Is the military good at the military mission that it's doing? And here the poll results are pretty clear. That drives public confidence in the military. If you prime the public with information that the military is not doing well, you can drive down confidence. So it does respond to bad news. Abu Ghraib, probably a little bit of a drop in confidence after those reports. You can drive down public confidence, but the public has baked into its view of the military the idea that the military is very competent and is good at what it does. And so it's a view that's anchored and takes a fair bit of a push to drive it down. I'll just flag a third one because it's somewhat related, and that is professional ethics. The public likewise believes that the military is ethical in how it wields its responsibilities. And if you prime the public with information that suggests it's not ethical, then again, you can drive down the public confidence. And so the public sort of starts with the view, our military is good, good at what they do, they're ethical in what they do, and then it's hard to move them, but not impossible to move them. And I do think that an unvarnished assessment of the sort you were suggesting, Eliot, would uncover genuine criticisms, and it would have the effect of driving down confidence. I don't that That's a price worth paying, I think, for deservedness. My recommendation at the end of the book is the military should not worry about keeping public confidence high. It should worry about deserving high public confidence. That's the focus. And when they make mistakes, they should own up.
So, Peter, let me poke at different elements of this. So, first, the book makes a point that the public has a lot of difficulty seeing the military in, sort of kind of granularity of detail. So there's not a whole lot of distinction made between retired former senior officers who they see on, television, providing commentary on events with active duty. There's not that much distinction between senior officers and the enlisted personnel. And the public doesn't seem to have any kind of detailed grasp that would enable it, for instance, to make reasonable judgments about performance. How well did the military perform? On top of that, you have the phenomenon that we talked about at the outset that you describe in some detail in the book, which clearly has an impact on confidence, which is the social desirability bias of saying, thank you for your service, honoring the military. All of which really does, kind of create this insulation particularly for the senior active duty military from criticism for performance. And I guess I would say two things. One, to Eliot's point, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of self-reflection. I mean, there have been efforts at lessons learned. There's been a very, interesting and pretty good 2-volume detailed history of the U.S. Army's performance in Iraq, for instance. But you don't get a sense that has been really reflected on or even read by a lot of senior officers. And you also have this, I would take maybe not an issue, but maybe just put one nuance into what Eliot said earlier. There does seem to be an awareness among junior officers that their seniors are not being held to account. And that came up a couple of times, while we were in office, with articles appearing in professional military journals by active duty officers saying, hey, wait, how come no one got, fired for some of these failures? And to his credit, I think Bob Gates, when he was SecDef, did try to bring some of that back a little bit by making some changes, by essentially firing some people when things went wrong. But, what's so striking about what Gates did is how singular it was. And it really hasn't happened, it didn't happen before. Obviously, his tenure really hasn't happened since. I would invite either or both of you to comment on any of that. Well,
I agree with you that the public doesn't follow the issues closely enough for this level of granularity to shape its attitudes. The polls show that the public can distinguish, that knows that there is a difference between officer and enlisted or something, knows in the abstract there are different services, but they're not closely following it, and so their view of the military tends to be, more of a blobby moving like that. That doesn't mean, though, that those differences aren't important. And you put your finger on it. One of the challenges senior leaders have is not maintaining public confidence, but maintaining confidence within the rank and file, and partly for the reasons that you identified. But I want to flag a second factor, which I think may be even, I won't say more impactful, but just as impactful. And that is a change really late in the Trump years that tried to drive a wedge right between the senior military leaders and the rank and file. And he was messaging the public, he being President Trump. So he really was trying to shift the public's attitudes. And he wanted to say, public, don't have confidence in the generals because they're criticizing me. Do have confidence in the rank and file who are keeping quiet, and I'm going to tell you they all support me. And so that was a very unusual moment to have an American commander-in-chief sort of try to split, the public's views between the senior leaders and the rank and file. And the polling, which was done since my book, confirms that he had some success. It's not just, of course, it wasn't just him making this message. Tucker Carlson and other Republican leaders have echoed it as well. And the biggest drop in confidence has been among Republicans. And I think that I trace that back to this effort by President Trump and others to sort of separate the military that doesn't seem to like Trump from the military that does seem to like Trump, and create sort of a two-tier system for the public.
So I wanted to push a little bit further on that. First, one thing is, it does strike me that the criticism that the military does get has nothing to do with military competence. So if it's on the right, it's the military is woke. There is a quite significant critique on the left, which has had real consequences, which is the military doesn't deal with sexual offenses and is inequitable to women and stuff like that. And that's actually had real consequences in terms of pulling certain kinds of investigations and disciplinary procedures out of the normal chain of command. So one question I suppose I have for you is, are those norms shifting? I mean, in particular, setting aside, well, it's hard to set aside Trump, but to the extent one can, I mean, it is striking to me that someone like DeSantis, and there are, I think, other politicians as well, are now willing to be openly critical of the military for being quote unquote woke. And, in a certain way, it's almost criticizing them for being unmanly. I mean, that's the kind of this, to be perfectly honest, that's the subtext there. They're not they're not heroic figures. Now, he hasn't been able to translate that into a critique of actual military competence, because I don't think it works. But it's striking that it's there, and I wonder if
Ted Cruz, Eliot, Ted Cruz explicitly made that argument. Remember, he was the one who put the video of the Russian military engaging in exercises up and saying, "Oh, look at this manly military as opposed to our feminized military because it's so woke." And you can see how well that masculine military has performed in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I mean but still, I mean, it is striking that that's now changed. The military is fair game in the culture wars. On both sides, primarily from the right, but there is some from the left. Is that significant, or do you think that that's just, this is more the afterwash of Trump?
No, this is well, certainly part of the afterwash of Trump. I think he accelerated and transformed and created permission space for Republicans to do things that in a previous era only the most extreme nut wing of Republicans would ever dare to say some of the things that are now coming out of senior Republican voices. I don't think we can diminish, or we can minimize, I should say, Trump's role, but I think it fits into a larger phenomenon, which I would call the politicization of the military. And that is mostly done to the military by civilians, although occasionally, as we've talked about in a previous podcast, the military can be sloppy or, allow themselves to be politicized, or in the case of retired military officers campaigning on behalf of presidential candidates, they can be actively politicizing themselves. But what happens in this politicization, and what the polling suggests, is that the public looks at the military and says, the military is politicized when they agree with my the opposite party. So Democrats say, when the military agrees with me, say it's implementing, strong policies designed to recruit all Americans from all walks of life, what Democrats would call DEI policies. Okay, then the military is not being politicized. But when it's agreeing with the other party, then it's being politicized. And of course, Republicans do the same, and that's what the Republican critique of woke is it's attacking the military using a civilian cultural war context. And it's very bad for the military. And I have a norm that I'm trying to get out there, which is let's give the military non-combatant immunity in the culture wars. Let's have them, not be combatants, so they can't be targeted. So the Republicans should stop targeting them, as, say, Tuberville is doing with his hold. But the Democrats can't hide behind them. If they have a culture, a policy that's controversial, it should be civilians who are defending it, not the military. And then the military have to learn how to talk about these issues without sounding like they're culture warriors. It's a norm that I think we need to take hold to push back against what is otherwise just a tidal wave of pressure politicizing the military. Over time, I think it's going to undermine public confidence in the military. It hasn't done so automatically because of this partisan effect where people will say, well, as long as they're agreeing with me, then I'm not going to consider them politicized. But that's I believe, temporary. And over time, if the military gets in this game, it's going to, spiral them down, as happened with the Supreme Court.
Just one quick follow-up on that. I wonder, though, if that's really feasible, because at the end of the day, militaries have to reflect at some level the values of the society they come from. We have some recent cases of things like gays in the military, large-scale integration of women in the military. Before that, racial integration of the military. You could have said, well, look, can't the military be exempt from these large and divisive issues that the society is wrestling with? And the answer was the military could adjust to them slower than perhaps the rest of society, although in the case of racial integration, it actually led rather than followed. Not really in the case, I think, of women or homosexuals, but at some level, isn't that truce always bound to break down?
Yes, I would say there's a difference between aligning with cultural values to include the evolution in cultural values, which is what you're talking about. And I agree, yes, the military has to. If it gets too far out of step, then it has a problem, especially in an all recruited force, where it needs to draw from the same civilian society. But that's different from what we're seeing, in the summer of 2023, where there's an active culture war dimension that goes, I think, beyond what you were just referencing. I think there's a way that the military can evolve without becoming a victim of the culture wars. It's also the case that if there's a problem in civilian society, it will show up in the military. If there's a suicide problem in civilian society, it'll show up in the military. Drug problem, it'll show up in the military. Sexual assault, it'll show up in the military. That doesn't mean that we can tolerate it in the military at the same levels that we, as a society, unfortunately, tolerate those ills in our civilian society, because the military has a special role. And so we are right to hold the military to a higher standard of suicide prevention, a higher standard of sexual assault, sexual harassment prevention. We can't say, well, as long as they're no worse than the average college, we're not going to deal with it. No, we have to. The average college needs to reform, but the military desperately needs to reform in order to keep its to be mission effective. And at the end of the day, that's sort of the Occam's razor that comes back to cut through. Should we go this way or that way? there's a genuine mission that the military has to meet, and will this foster the mission or will it undermine it? The reason the military cares about integrating Americans from all walks of life is unit cohesion matters. And if you can't integrate the people, if they can't trust each other in the foxhole, then they're not going to be mission effective. And it turns out you can get folks from all different walks of life to trust each other in the foxhole, provided that you are training and supporting them correctly.
So, Peter, you talked about the all recruited force, and I would love to hear you on how this whole set of issues we've just been discussing impacts the current recruiting crisis, right? I mean, our collective mutual friend, Brian Lynn, has an article, I think, in Parameters in the most recent issue saying, the recruiting issue, we've always had this. It's nothing new. It's not a new phenomenon, which at some level, of course, is correct. And as you point out in the book, recruiting has always been, co-varied to some degree with economic conditions, at least since the advent of the all-volunteer force in the late 70s. But it does strike me that this pattern of increasing criticism by Republicans who have had the highest support for confidence in the military, the attack on the military as woke, in addition to the economic situation, which is clearly a major part of this, is partly responsible for driving this recruiting crisis because, people largely from the South and from Republican leaning or conservative leaning families are not signing up as much as in the past. And that's so how do you parse out all of this, and in terms of the recruiting problem? I mean, all the services, I think, are missed their numbers except possibly maybe the Marines.
The Marines,
but everybody else has missed them.
As they remind
the Marines may have made them, but everybody else has missed them, and the Army, by significant margins, has missed them.
So, the recruiting crisis is a crisis, and if Brian is saying it's not a crisis, then I wouldn't align.
He's
with
not
that
saying
view.
it's not a crisis. He's just saying we've had this crisis before.
The crisis we've seen before. Yes, that's where I agree with him. It is a crisis, but it's a crisis we've seen before. And I'm of the view it's a crisis that can be managed. And I'd rather manage it than break the all-volunteer force and go to a whole other form of raising and maintaining, namely conscription. I think conscription is a cure worse than the disease. But what I would distinguish between tier 1 causes and tier 2 causes. And the declining public confidence is a tier 2 cause, not a tier 1. Tier 1, it's labor economics, first and foremost. It's also changing, generational changes in the approach to careers and what they're looking for. And, the youngest cohort, 18 to 24, who, of course, is the target for recruits, they want more flexibility. They want more autonomy. One famous story that a recruiter told me was, they asked, could I go do distance work from home, join the military and work from home? Well, it doesn't quite work that way. So changes in generational changes in attitudes to what work conditions should look like. COVID was and the difficulty recruiters had to get access, a big factor. And then a fourth one that doesn't get a lot of attention has to do with the tracking of medical conditions, particularly the use of prescription drugs, which was done, that was not tracked as carefully before, and it was easy to get waivers. Now it's tracked more carefully, and the incidences of it have gone up post-COVID, and so now it's much harder to get waivers. That's tier 1.
Marijuana use also has gotten in the way, despite the fact that it's legal in 44 states.
Yeah. So then tier 2 is things like the politicization and public confidence. And the way they affect recruitment is through shaping the attitudes of the influencers. So there's not a lot of polling evidence to say that somebody chose not to go into the military because they personally were afraid it was woke. There is evidence that people are less likely to recommend to their kid or to their, if they're a coach, to their, athlete or whatever, to join the military when confidence goes down. And if they think that the military has, is, a leftist organization or something like that. So those, the confidence number is affected, on the margins by shaping the influencers. And then from the left, there is evidence that a number of individuals are not likely to join or have declined propensity to enlist for fear of exposure to sexual assault, sexual harassment, and also not wanting their daughters or their nieces or whatever to join. And so that problem the military needs to get a hold of, and would affect recruiting if they could, change the reality and the public's.
I would add one thing on the declining propensity to serve to the pretty comprehensive list that you just gave, which is at least what I hear from senior officials in the Department of Defense. There is expressed by younger people in that age cohort the sense that if you enter the military, you're going to come out damaged with PTSD or traumatic brain injury or what have you, which is, I guess, a part of the long kind of critique of the endless wars, but it's also a little bit kind of temporally out of sync, because we haven't really had large numbers of people in combat for a decade. I mean, we've had small groups of special forces in Syria or Iraq, and maybe in places like Mali, but and Niger, but not like it was in the first decade after 9/11. So that seems to be playing a role here as well.
Although you do have to ask yourself as you watch the war in Ukraine. So I think there was a report leaked that we now estimate that the Russians may have had about 300,000 dead and wounded, the Ukrainians something 200,000 dead and wounded. If, God forbid, we ever got into a really big war, I find it very hard to believe that you could wage that war with an all-volunteer force. It's just, I think one of the hard lessons we're learning is a quantitative one. I was wondering, since we've been rattling along here, I was wondering if we could shift to a different piece of civil-military relations, and that's not so much the military and society or the military and elites, but the military at the very top and political leaders. And Peter, I'll give away a minor secret. You and I belong to a small group of somewhat paranoid students of civil military relations. We're always kind of comparing notes on the latest.
Trying to scare each other.
Trying to be, each one trying to be more pure than the other and maintaining civilian authority and control. But the challenge is never really, I think, a sort of outright defiance. I mean, even Douglas MacArthur, when you look closely at that case, that wasn't it. It's a bit more subtle. So I wanted to just do a little bit of a lightning round with you and with you, Eric, since Lord knows you had to live this. So recently, just like a day or two before we tape this, the commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe and Africa said that, well, the Ukrainians really won't be able to master the use of F-16s for 5 years. Now, first, that's a professional judgment, which I think is open to dispute. But quite apart from that, that is a statement which can have real political consequences in terms of, what sort of support for Ukraine do we go ahead and give them F-16s? If I could ask both of you, thumbs up, thumbs down, is that appropriate or inappropriate?
I'll let Eric go first.
Look, part of the problem is, on a lot of these issues, and this is something that the three of us have talked about before, at the very senior levels, the line between what is a professional military judgment and what is a political judgment is very blurred. In addition to the example you just gave, Eliot, you could also adduce the example not long ago of General Minahan, who, was saying we're going to be going to war with China, in the next couple of years, which may or may not be right. I tend to be, as it goes with China, I tend to be on the more alarmist side of the spectrum by and large. But whether it was appropriate for, a 4-star to say that publicly, or in an unclassified setting, that I think is open to question as well. My own view is that when it comes to these kinds of statements, senior military leaders would be well advised to take, the advice that Speaker Sam Rayburn, once used to give to young politicians, and which I used to keep on an index card taped in front of me whenever I was testifying in front of the U.S. Congress, which is nobody ever got in trouble for something they didn't say. And that goes, by the way, for civilian leaders as well. I think there's far too much commentary nowadays, in part because of the ubiquity of the media, in and around the decision-making process. People ought not be saying things on the record, and they ought not be saying things on background. There has been Eliot, you and I have had some exchanges on Signal about this. There's been a concatenation of background briefing in the Financial Times, New York Times, Washington Post, of administration figures second-guessing the Ukrainians. Their offensive's doing badly. They're not doing the right things. They've got their forces, malapportioned. They shouldn't be in the South. They ought to be defending Kupiansk, blah, 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 whatever. They're not capable of making real gains. Those judgments may or may not be right. I tend to think they're not, but they ought not be expounded, in the press at the same time the administration is trying to go to Congress for $20 billion worth of additional, material support in a supplemental for Ukraine, because that kind of background is just undermining their case.
So my response will be a little more cagey. The polling shows that the military cues can nudge public opinion. Meaning, if a military leader says something, it can nudge the public in one direction or the other. The effect is bigger when the military says something surprising and against type. So a military person saying we're going to go to war tomorrow, that would be shocking, and so that would have a bigger impact. A military person saying we need to spend more on defense, that's not going to move public needle much. A military person saying we're spending way too much on defense, we can cut back, that would have a bigger impact. That's the first thing I'll say. The second thing is that there is a big difference between military candor in private and military outspokenness in public. And I think that goes to the heart of what you were just saying, Eric, that I think a senior Air Force general opining on how long it'll take for the Ukrainians to learn to fly the F-16, I hope he's giving that view to his senior leaders inside the chain of command, because that's a genuine militarily relevant, and he's an expert, presumably, and so he has an informed opinion on that. But what you're talking about, Eliot, is if you say that publicly, now you're part of the information warfare space. You have to be much more careful.
I think that's exactly the point. Of course, there should be, and in some ways, there should be more candor in private than I think I saw, and I suspect, Eric, that you saw. It is quite striking how you can see very highly decorated general or flag officers, and when they get to the presence of the President of the United States or even the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, all of a sudden, everything is going swimmingly, Madam Secretary. Just a few hiccups here and there. Let me ask just one other quick one. So General Milley, who's about to retire, who we all know quite well, was, after initially apparently thinking that the Ukrainians would be done in a few days, sort of changed his view. But then, he gives this is a statement where he's saying, well, it's going to be a long, hard slog, and eventually this should be solved by negotiation. Again, and I'd ask the two of you not to weasel, please, because I will give a very forthright answer, whether or not the two of you do. Should he have said that in public, not in private?
I think it's fine for Milley to say that this, from his vantage point right now, looks like a long, hard slog. That's a reasonable military judgment, period. That's where he should have stopped his comment. To talk about whether it should be a diplomatic solution or not is, to me, that's policy.
I'm willing to give him a little bit of rope, but maybe I'm pettifogging and being academic. But every war, even the wars that ended with surrender, require some negotiations at the end. So there was surrender even in Japan, and certainly in the East in in the West in World War II. And if that's what he meant, that at some point the Russians and the Ukrainians are going to have to sit down and forge a post-war agreement, I think he's right. And I've written on that subject. So I do think that the war will have to end that way. But if he's saying we need to throttle back the military support in order to put pressure for the Ukrainians to make a diplomatic concession and thus seek some sort of temporary ceasefire, now he's in if that's what was meant, that's in the realm of policy and will cross the line.
I would hit the buzzer on that one, Peter, because the truth is, when somebody like that, first, he's not talking about the quote unquote negotiations that where Admiral Donitz signs the ceasefire, or the Japanese officials are on the quarterdeck of the Missouri. That wasn't much of a negotiation, let's face it. But I think the point that I would make is, when somebody of that seniority says something, it is consequential, and the way it almost doesn't make a difference how you intended it to be taken; it's how it is taken.
Eliot, just on that point, look, it's a lot of this, of course, depends on the context. And in a context where presidential candidates are saying, we have to make the Ukrainians, negotiate, or we have to end this with a negotiation, that kind of comment inevitably plays into a policy debate. That was why I, took issue with it. I mean, Peter, I take your point that, every war must end, right? As one of my, distinguished predecessors as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy argued in a very, very good little book. But I think senior officers in general, in my experience, are not sufficiently sensitive to the fact that when they speak as a 4-star, there are potential political consequences to what they say, and therefore they ought to err, on the side of being laconic in their responses.
All right, I think on this one, I am, as the French would say, pur et dur, pure and hard. We're just about out of time, and if Eric, with your permission, I'd like to shift over to something completely different. Only those of our listeners who are students at Duke know that Peter is a fantastic teacher of undergraduates. He's written a book on the subject. I've taught many of his students when they've taken a step down and come into my classes for graduate school. You really are terrific. And we were talking a little bit before about what it's like teaching in the age of ChatGPT. And I'll just kind of stake out my own position. First, thank goodness I'm retired from teaching. And in part because I wouldn't like to have to deal with this. And having tried ChatGPT a few times, it has always struck me as resembling a mediocre, extremely ambitious, kind of somewhat sycophantic sophomore, who will dish up anything that you really want. If you say, I didn't like that answer, it'll say, oh, I'm terribly sorry. And that'll give you something else that's completely fallacious also. So how do you, and of course, this is just where ChatGPT 3.5 or 4 point something. But it's going to be a serious issue, what these models can do. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit to our listeners, some of whom may be students, some of whom may have kids who are students, about what's the world of teaching and learning in this era.
Well, the truth is we're still figuring this out, and we have to fly this plane as we build it. And I'm prepared to hear back that I failed miserably in the approach I'm going to be taking. But there's broadly two approaches. One is that you build up the castle walls, you widen the moat, and you say everything is going to be done hand, pencil, and paper, and in real time, no access. And I think that's appropriate for some evaluative exercise. I've always done some of that. That's a very real life situation. So there are times when you are hauled before your boss and asked, a question, and you don't have any time. You got to be able to answer it in real time. So but I don't think you can have all your evaluative exercises in that, because one of the most important skills, Eliot and Eric, well, is writing. You have to be able to write to work in our business. That when you're working in the national security, they care about your oral and your written expression. And so that requires papers, and that opens the door for use and misuse of ChatGPT. I liken it to Wikipedia in the early days. I don't know if you remember what it was like, but the first year or two of Wikipedia, it was, a swamp. It's gotten much better, and now Wikipedia is, a reliable first step, like an Encyclopedia Americana, that you pull off the shelf and take a quick look. When did the battle happen? Okay, that'll give you the quick answer. In the early days, you couldn't be sure. I think ChatGPT is going to evolve in that same way. And within a few years, our students are going to expect to be able to use it in their post-college employment. Thus, I think it's important that we help them learn how to use it responsibly. And so that's what I'm going to be trying to do this year. Is there a responsible way of using ChatGPT? You put your finger on one of them. Is if you think that the output of ChatGPT is truth, then you are not using it responsibly or wisely, because it will make up stuff. Well, I think we need to teach our students how to fact check the outputs of ChatGPT. It'll also, paper over with banalities when you want hard, incisive things. Well, first drafts often look that way. I mean, I'm sure you can think of first drafts you've read that were pretty mushy and they needed to be tightened up. So I think ChatGPT is going to be used for an iterative process, helping a little bit, but then the human is supposed to improve on what the AI produces, and back and forth. And I'm going to try to have my students do it that way, and talk to me a year from now, and I'll tell you if I succeeded or failed.
I think that Eliot thinks that your and my answers to his pop quiz on who violated, best practices on civil military relations was filled with the banalities that ChatGPT would generate.
But you guys typing, while I was asking the question.
But so. We are already over time, and at the risk of imposing on you, Peter, there is one last question I just have to ask, which is, to me, the most distressing part of this book, the most upsetting part of your book, because, as Eliot pointed out, I've lived on this divide of civil military relations, was the degree to which the public is either completely ignorant of or at odds with what we in this, kind of rarefied world of experts on civil military relations and military institutions regard as the appropriate norms and guardrails for maintaining, civilian control of the military. And particularly given, as you talk about in the book from time to time, the deep suspicion that the founders had for the role of a standing army to democracy. The fact that the public is so at variance with those norms, frankly, was one of the things that surprised me more than anything else I read in the book, and disturbed me more. So what should we do about that?
Well, I think you're right. Clutched at a straw to say, well, at least the public doesn't want a military dictatorship. There's a range of questions ranging from, the most pure to the most sullied.
Only 19% wanted military rule in your survey.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, well, that's good news, sort of. But you're absolutely right that the public is not a good umpire or enforcer of civil military best practice. And so one of the things we have to do is we have to get the military to behave even when they're not going to be rewarded, punished by the public appropriately. That's professionalism. That's what professionals do. And, when I'm talking to the military, I emphasize that aspect of it. Don't look to the public as, well, if the public lets me get away with it, it must be okay. No. However, the public ignorance is a function, I think, of two things. One is the growing gap between the American public and the military. The passing of the World War II generation, the passing of the draft era, fewer and fewer families have kitchen table conversations with Uncle so-and-so about what it was like to serve in the military. That's now a very small subset of Americans who have that personal experience. So what they know, they're knowing from TV, Marvel, the universe, movies, who knows where the sources are. And that's a problem. But the second piece of it is the decline of civics education in the country. And in particular, and I'm pandering to my hosts, but in the decline of military and diplomatic history that taught at the K through 12 level, or at least at the high school level. So my students are coming in with much less of a knowledge base just of how the wars happened and how they went and how diplomacy happened, knowing the warts and the positive aspects. And when you know those things, you have a healthier respect for the military, but also a healthier respect for the limits of the military. And that's reclaiming civics, I think, is an important priority. And if we have those civics courses, they can buy my book on Amazon and OUP and learn all they could possibly want to know about public confidence in the military.
We can all agree on that.
We can. Our guest today has been Peter Feaver, professor of political science and public policy at Duke University, and the estimable author of Thanks for Your Service, The Causes and Consequences of Public Confidence in the U.S. Military. Peter, thanks for joining us on Shield of the Republic. We'll unfortunately make you come back again in the future.
I hope so. Thank you for having me.